Right, good afternoon everyone. 2016 was a milestone year for the UK industry because we published our first good practice principles on biodiversity net gain. And we did this because industry was asking, what does good look like? We're interested in biodiversity net gain, but there were no standards and no benchmark. And that's how we in industry work. Now the principles, there are 10 of them, and they showed us this is what biodiversity net gain is, and most importantly, what it's not as well. Then earlier this year, we've just published, so I encourage you to go to the websites of these three professional organisations, and please come and see me afterwards if you're interested, new guidance to back up those principles. So this is about implementing biodiversity net gain, but according to good practice. Now this is really, really important because biodiversity net gain at the moment is voluntary. So we need these strict industry standards to make sure that we're doing it right. So just this afternoon, just to go through a snapshot, I thought, well, what are the main things in terms of implementing biodiversity net gain with good practice? And to me, there's 5 key things that we need to really focus on. The first, as always, is apply the mitigation hierarchy. So the mitigation hierarchy is a series of measures where you first look to avoid your impacts on biodiversity, then you look to minimize your impacts, and only as a last stage do you look to compensate for unavoidable losses. Now, we do this in industry as part of the impact assessment process, but I think what's really important for biodiversity net gain is to get much better on the evidence. An ecologist report with recommendations is not evidence of actually doing something. And as a sneaky preview, I've been very lucky from Natural England to show you a screenshot of their draft tool in terms of updating the DEFRA biodiversity metric. Now, I've promised to say it is unpublished, so this might change. But within the DEFRA metric, they are embedding the mitigation hierarchy to really get very specific in terms of the habitat areas that come under each step of that, which I think is incredibly exciting and very welcome. So the second point is to set thresholds. The concept of biodiversity net gain is an overall positive impact for biodiversity. And there are some key features that does not apply to. So when we're talking about biodiversity, we need to make very clear and very, very strong statements on what good practice is, but also what biodiversity net gain is not. And that's simply avoiding those features that you cannot offset by gains elsewhere. Now, 2 of those key features are irreplaceable habitats, especially ancient woodland, and also statutory designated sites such as SSSI and Ramsar sites. So it's really important to make clear that while industry is looking at biodiversity net gain, and it's really important, we need to make very clear that it's not to do with those key features. If you impact and lose those features, that's a permanent loss. There's no net gain that can be achieved. In terms of setting thresholds, it's not just biodiversity, it's also people's values of biodiversity. And I've been incredibly lucky to be part of a team who developed new principles on good practice to do with people. So this is all to do with the people aspects of biodiversity, and it's freely available on the web. And one of the principles is to avoid impacts on people's well-being that cannot be compensated for. So this is really interesting because the biodiversity itself might not be the best biodiversity for nature. It might be fairly low grade, but in terms of people, they have strong cultural values associated with it. If you lose that biodiversity, they cannot be compensated for. So it's to set thresholds for both biodiversity and for people. Now this aspect of biodiversity is a huge part of my day job for Balfour Beatty. And one example, I'm not sure many of you might have seen, the protests about High Speed 2 taking down the trees outside Euston Station. This is because people valued those trees, for the sake of those trees, as well as what they do for nature. But it's a really good example of how people's values, especially to do with trees in cities and the wider green infrastructure in cities, are really important, that we don't confuse that issue with biodiversity net gain. So set thresholds for both biodiversity, but also for people's values on that biodiversity. The third aspect is to optimize sustainability. And the principle, the wording of the principle is actually prioritize biodiversity net gain. So biodiversity net gain comes first, that's most important. But then afterwards, look at what you can achieve in terms of the wider economic and social benefits of biodiversity net gain. Now, we all know, many of us in the room know, that if you do good stuff for nature, you have all these wider benefits, such as climate regulation, water regulation, recreational benefits, and air quality. Now, my managers within Balfour Beatty particularly love that. For them, it's they invest in me and they invest in nature. They get two for the price of one. And that's particularly important because we work alongside a lot of road networks. But what I'm really interested in is, as the last speaker mentioned, is actually measuring this and making much more informed decisions. So this isn't just a nice to have, but it's a core deliverable, it's a core part of what we do when we build these larger infrastructure projects. And to give you an example, I worked on a network rail scheme that went through the mitigation hierarchy, and it did get to a stage when part of the net gain process was to offset with gains elsewhere. It worked with a lot of local groups and invested in their local nature reserves. We ran a natural capital assessment of that, and it was about a £60,000 investment. And the natural capital account showed the various millions that we gained from that in terms of recreational benefit, climate regulation, and air quality. Now, a lot of my clients are government agencies, and they have to demonstrate spend of taxpayers' money. So this stuff is becoming more and more important in not only to integrate these aspects within the day-to-day deliverable of infrastructure projects, but to make much better informed decision making. Measurable. Many of you might not know, this is DEFRA's biodiversity metric. So this is how we measure biodiversity net gain, and it's a way of putting a nominal figure on biodiversity. It's a habitat-based metric that we can use in order to measure the outcomes. Now, there's a variety of benefits in there. To me, this has been an absolute game changer in terms of raising the profile of biodiversity within the boardroom. So from a communication point of view to a business audience, it's become incredibly important. But we need to really think in terms of how we use the metric when we're making decisions. Now, I love DEFRA's metric, I do, but it won't tell me about the rain garden in Gospel Oak. It won't tell me that a particular habitat is great for dormice. It won't tell me about the wildflowers along a verge. So it's about using a metric appropriately and not forgetting that we still need the rich ecological information behind to make real decisions about numbers, about biodiversity net gain. So the numbers help in terms of how much, but net gain is not about making a decision based on a single number. It's about having that picture in terms of qualitative and quantitative information when you are deciding on biodiversity net gain. It's also about telling the story of each habitat. If you ever see a report about a site that has one single biodiversity unit that covers woodland or grassland or wetlands, question it. Because we shouldn't have a single biodiversity number to represent all of those different habitats. And this is just an example of the way that we still need to follow the story of each habitat as we go through these developments. But it's not just about biodiversity units. So this is an example. You might have a development site where you have a baseline and then you have the afterworks picture, and these are biodiversity units. And then it goes to the mitigation hierarchy, and the offset site has the increase in biodiversity units. So a net gain in terms of biodiversity units. but are we losing or are we gaining green space? And what's really important to note is if you have the same, if you have a development, say Balfour Beatty, we come along and we take down those trees and build a hotel, and we achieve net gain by enhancing an existing patch of trees, we have actually lost green space. So while DEFRA's metric is great in many ways, we also need to recognise, especially in urban areas where it's really difficult to then create new habitat, the metric can easily show net gain, but we might have lost green space. So it's using a number, which I love, but it's using it appropriately. The final aspect, and this is where I personally get really excited about net gain, is making a contribution. And that's an inherent part of what good practice is for biodiversity net gain. So this is what my business leaders get really excited about, is the National Infrastructure Delivery Plan. I'm now there because we have biodiversity net gain being voluntarily committed to by various clients, which is fantastic. But it's making it meaningful. It's investing in biodiversity net gain in the local green infrastructure strategy and the local biodiversity action plan, in whatever that local priorities are for nature. So we're not just doing biodiversity net gain for the sake of it, we're making it meaningful. If we follow the mitigation hierarchy, and if we reach a stage where we need to offset, we reach out to local wildlife groups and we invite them to submit their proposals. And these are actually examples of local planning authorities, local friends of group, local wildlife trusts who have come to us with their offset ideas. Now, I'm very fortunate to work on these large infrastructure projects where we have the resource to be able to do such outreach, but it's not always feasible for development. So what we're really hoping and trying to work with local authorities to see is actually have biodiversity net gain firmly embedded in the local plans, in the green infrastructure plans. Whereas for developers, we then make the contribution according to something that's already thought out and is already strategically there. So it's a whistle-stop tour in terms of biodiversity net gain. Please search out those good practice principles. Please search out the guidance that's just come out. But 5 key ways to embed good practice for biodiversity net gain is to evidence the mitigation hierarchy, to set thresholds about what it's not just for biodiversity, but for people's values on biodiversity, to optimize sustainability, and there's some really interesting work with natural capital accounting on that. To use numbers, I do love a graph, so we need to use numbers, but we need to use numbers appropriately and make sure that we are making decisions based on nature. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what contribution are we making. Thank you very much.